Good evening all, my name is Carl Jevons from Hesperia, and on behalf of Open House I'd like to welcome you all here today, those of you that are obviously in the studio and our friends that are here at Besk in West Leederville. Being a local of Besk in West Leederville, it's an amazing place that Elliot runs, and also a colleague, esteemed colleague of yours, Ben Brahm, also operates, who is an architect. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we gather here today, the Whadjuk and Noongar people, and pay respects to elders past and present and emerging, of course. Before we get moving as well, I'd also like to acknowledge Carly Barrett. She's been part of Open House and started it for 10 years, so her enthusiasm for this project has just been astounding, and your passion for design and architecture and what you've done for this place has been truly remarkable. It's something that we're all very grateful for, so thank you very much, Carly. The What If series provides a terrific opportunity to delve a bit deeper into many of the projects that have not been realised in Perth. Some of them would have had a profound impact on the way that we live in this city, and then some of them might have been so ambitious that they might have been white elephants, but the reality is we don't really know. And I think what we've certainly learnt out of that process is that it inspires discussion, creates ideas, and gives us an opportunity to consider what our future is. And as we look at what has occurred in the last 6 months, there are going to be changes to how we live and work, and it's going to be fascinating to see how, certainly from an architectural perspective, how that can evolve. We've got two highly esteemed and respected architects with us today, Jimmy Thompson of MJA and Felipe Soto of Hillam Architects. Both of their practices have their arms firmly wrapped around the landscape architecture of WA. And I think, importantly, as this city has began to evolve and grow, which is a relatively immature city, the improvements that they've made, in particular across residential and mixed-use projects, have really lifted the standard of that sort of lifestyle in WA, which has been incredibly important as we've tried to change from a relatively sprawling culture to one that embraces an urban way of living. So for that, I think we can also be very grateful. Jimmy in particular, I've had the pleasure of working with for the last 2 years on several different projects, and albeit he looks relatively young and celebrated a birthday in his 30s this week, the quality and the quantity of his work I think almost puts you in veteran status now. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jimmy, and he's going to give some background about the project, which would have been an amazing outcome, the Subiaco Wave Park. So Jimmy, thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Kyle. Hello everyone at Besk, and anyone watching on YouTube. Jimmy Thompson, Design Director at MJA Studio, and tonight we're going to go going back to 2015. A very different world. Back in 2015, the Fremantle Dockers had just finished top on the ladder. It was a very strange place, but ourselves as a practice, I guess we were working on multi-residential projects, and especially dual aspect multi-residential projects. We were really interested in this typology where you can basically get light and ventilation on both sides of your apartment, and you have no enclosed corridor or lobby spaces. So that's something which we really thought responded to the West Australian climate. We were working on hospitality projects, we were working on community projects and some commercial projects. And we'd also just started picking up, well, we'd won a competition essentially to start work on designing some wave gardens, both in Perth and in the eastern states. And these wave gardens essentially, they're not amusement parks, and it's something you really need to understand, that they're essentially like training facilities, similar to a rugby oval or an AFL pitch. There are places where professionals will perform at very high standards, where kids can learn, and where people like me, who being quite balance challenged, might actually come down for a drink, watch people surf for a few hours and decide that I might give it a crack one day, or not. But we've never been able to actually work on an integrated project, a big mixed use project which brought together all these different typologies. And we always wanted to, because we think, going forward, that integrated large-scale mixed-use development is where we as a city should be going. So one day we got a letter in the post. Our practice has always been based in Subi, and essentially the letter said, "Dear constituent, we'd like you to participate in a survey for what we think should happen for the future of Subiaco, knowing that the AFL was leaving." And we thought, bugger that, we don't want to do a survey, we'll give you a scheme instead. And so we started to think about Subi and the history of Subi and what was associated with it. And so for the last 150 odd years, it's been footy, it's been markets, it's been its heritage, its parks, but also it has a very strong sense of community. But we knew that essentially footy was going, that decision had been made, the markets were gone, parks, especially Kitchener Park, was under pressure. And so we started to really think about what does Subi want to be associated with in the 21st century. And for us, the idea of inclusivity, where we can actually create public space which encourages a wider demographic to congregate together, was really important to us. We wanted to expand public space rather than actually diminish it and reduce it as we create high density areas. And also the quality of public space we thought needed to be more than flat grass, sort of areas which is predominant throughout Perth, that we thought these spaces needed to be programmed in a different type of way. And we wanted to introduce a sense of urbanity which was vastly different to what was in Subi, and especially what resulted out of Subi Centro, which was pretty banal at best. So we thought, we need a different type of urbanism for Subi. And accessibility, not just in terms of transport, but also in terms of providing disabled access across an entire sort of public space, and something which was very interesting. We wanted to expand recreation opportunities, both passive and active, and again, build on this sort of long history of community within Subi. So the problem was that at the time, there was a bit of a Mexican standoff in terms of Subi Oval. You had the state owned it, it was Crown land, it was vested, or essentially Subi had a management order across it, and the WA Football Commission had a lease on it. They all didn't like each other, nothing was ever going to happen here. And there's also a bit of a conflict between, within the TPS at Subi, it was zoned Parks and Rec, but restricted public access. Whereas within Perth and Peel at 3.5 million, it was designated as essentially activity centre, a core activity centre at that. So at the time, there'd been this North Subi urban design study done, which picked up a broader sort of precinct, but it had some pretty scary sections in it, which didn't look that exciting and, well, actually just looked really scary. And so when we went through all the feedback from this urban design study, there were 3 words which kept coming out in all the feedback, and that was sport, open space, and mixed use. So we thought, well, let's retain a sports use, let's link and expand the open space, let's actually create a mixed use heart for the precinct. We knew that once PMH got vacated and developed, that you can't just have sort of acres and acres of just multi-res. You need to actually have some sort of heart or hub to it. And we really wanted to reinforce the transit connections between 2 train stations were actually really quite close to one another. So we essentially presented to the City of Subi initially that today we have an oval, tomorrow you won't have an oval, it'll be demolished, and we want to replace it with a large water body. And at about this time in the presentation, they all sort of looked somewhat bewildered and amused. But for a sense of scale, that lagoon or lake is essentially the 2 lakes of Hyde Park combined. So if you imagine this place it's like Hyde Park, essentially, the scale of what we're talking about. And then we wanted to sort of wrap this whole water body in parklands. But importantly, we wanted to elevate that parkland so that you actually create a hill for Subi. And we wanted to then activate the ground floor along the west, along the north and along the south, bring back markets, which would be permanent markets. We wanted to get hospitality, which could work both sides, lagoon side and street side, and introduce wellness in there as well. And then insert 220 dual aspect apartments, which would overlook the lagoon. We would then create a link in a new public space, which would be a market square, which would help link West Leederville Station with Market Square Park in Subi and just reinforce that pedestrian link. And then, following the tradition of Subi and terrace housing along the railway, introduce essentially a series of attached housing along there to provide some diversity. And then you would have Subi Surf Park as a facility installed within that lagoon. So here's an image of it, 2015. And then an image as Subi Surf Park and an integrated mixed-use development. And in here you can see Kitchener Park, instead of getting built on with a pretty ordinary building like in that section, it actually gets retained and linked into a big loop essentially, which rides at 1 in 20, so disabled access, no need for handrails, basically does a 320 metre arc up, giving you essentially like a running track of 950 metres, giving you a really interesting public space up there. And then looking back the other way from the west towards the city, you can see the apartments, which essentially are 5 floors within there, the parkland beyond, and then view to the city. So within an exploded axo, you can see the basement parking, surf park, activated grounds, apartments, and then this horseshoe park. And we imagine this horseshoe park is like an elevated, almost 13,000 square metre extension to Kitchener Park. And we imagined, both passive and active recreation, so that you could use it as a running track, you could use it as a picnic, but it was a really intriguing space, and we thought we could also program it with a bit of narrative around the Hall of Fame of all the people who played at Subi. The apartments themselves wrapped the lagoon, being dual aspect. You had no enclosed lobbies, so they were accessed by open air platforms essentially, and then you had balconies on both sides. So on the lagoon side, which is your sort of more public side, you could watch people surfing all day, and then if you wanted some privacy, you could flip around to the other side, and that's where you had that batten screened kind of facade protecting you from the west. In section, you can see how those apartments, that's a north-south section there, would overlook the lagoon. And you get this sense of what this could be like. And this isn't just a flat water body as well. There's the noise of the ocean essentially in terms of wave motion, but it's also dynamic. It's always constantly moving. We were really keen to get a market hall in there, so we allowed for 3,000 square metres, and that was a dedicated space, taking on some of the best ideas, this project by NVRDV in Rotterdam. And then it was going to open onto a market square, because Market Park, essentially, or Market Square Park in Subi has always been a peculiarly named place. So we wanted to actually give it a market so that you could actually link these two spaces and make sense of the thing. And then on that northern side, you get a run of 52 terrace housing, which could provide a diversity of housing within that zone, because it's always been essentially Department of Communities land through there. The surf park itself then gets installed. The really nice thing about this is that you can create all of this within a 5-storey plus roof terrace building. You don't have to have a lot of height in these sort of projects to actually achieve a lot if you think about them horizontally and think about them in a different type of way. The benefit of that is actually reducing overshadowing by 25% compared to Subi Oval itself. So there's a really good benefit to all those guys on the south. In terms of power and energy use, power and water use, the water that it was going to take every year was the equivalent to how much water you use to reticulate Subi Oval. So it's very much an equivalency there, and the power is equivalent to essentially a community aquatic centre. And so these facilities, you've got to understand, are community assets. And so we decided to present to a City of Subi, as I said, and we had the planning team there. They listened, they smiled, and then when we sort of went through it, they actually got it, and they thought, this is really cool. How are we going to do this? We presented about how it fits in with the TPS, we can totally do this. And then we thought, well, this is such a good idea, well, let's try and get some press. And so we pushed it out there. Unfortunately, Papa Smurf sort of outshone us on the front page, but we did manage to just sneak in there at the bottom. And then it all went a bit bananas. We went on the telly with our terrible haircuts, and then it got picked up by news all around the world. So Huffington Post in France picked it up. Within a couple of days, we had 46,000 views on YouTube. A whole bunch of design blogs picked it up. It was kind of hilarious, because speculative projects you do like this because you have an interest in it, and it'll be a bit of fun and something that you might not have done, and sometimes it's nice not to work with the client, just to have a bit of freedom. But you sort of, you have an idea over a beer, and then it's kind of funny when it blows up into something like this. Unbeknownst to us, some friends at JCY had been working on another what-if scheme, which we had no idea about, and we accidentally gazumped them on the site, which made us feel absolutely terrible. because their idea was really good as well. And the good thing about all of this, though, is, and any what-if project, is it actually sparks debate and conversation. And that's what we as designers and architects should be doing, is actually trying to lead conversation about how to make cities better. In the end, Subiaco Surf Park didn't happen. Thor went for a surf in Melbourne instead. There he is, having a good time with all his mates. But ever since it's opened, it's been going really well, and it's proved that this isn't an amusement park. This is actually a real community asset. Kids are learning to surf. People who are migrating to the country are learning how to deal with waves. There's a lot of benefits to it. There's a great hospitality story there. It's getting really well used, and people sit around watching waves and having a good time. I guess to finish the story, the state government went on to build a high school on the site, which was a bit unfortunate, mainly because, ironically, it also destroyed one of our other what-if projects. We'd been pitching for some time for Department of Communities, once they vacated their land, for that site to be turned into an inner-city high school. We were able to retain a number of the buildings there. You could use Langley Park as your playing fields, which could finally sort of activate that space. And so we lost another one. City of Subi came up with their own plan, Sands Wave Garden, and not looking quite as exciting. But now Development WA is taking on a much broader precinct and is looking at 30-storey buildings adjacent to Subi Oval. So we never got on the cover of Lonely Planet, which would have been a bit fun. But now we're taking these concepts further afield. So we're looking at sites in Miami. So this is an integrated mixed-use development. So golf course, hotel, putting green, function areas, hospitality, a number of different things going on over there. Live project and pretty fun and pretty exciting. Very much channeling old school Miami there. So I guess, wrapping all that up, why architects and designers do this project is often because we spot a gap or we spot a need and we think we might have a fun or otherwise sort of answer to it. But they're really good in just getting people talking about possibilities and potential. And I think Perth's got a lot of that.
Fantastic. Before maybe we move to Felipe, just one question. Obviously that takes a huge amount of collective resource and thought from your team. So at what point in time do you think this is a 5% chance? Is it fun? Is it a 25% chance? And how do you, as a practice like yours, come together to decide whether you go through this process?
We never thought it really had a chance, but we thought it was going to be fun. And I guess, but at the same time, we always knew that we could make it completely believable and also possible. So in terms of the planning, we could have actually done it. In terms of funders and development partners, a whole bunch of clients came to us and said, we would love to do this, and we wanted to do it. Urban Surf and Wave Garden had that portion covered, so that was 40% of the entire build. Really, if the government, Subi and the Football Commission had got on board, it could have happened reasonably easily.
All right, thank you, Jimmy. Fantastic presentation, and obviously, again, shows you some of the opportunities that are available if practices like yours put their minds to these things. The next presenter is Felipe. Felipe grew up in South America and then moved to Spain in his early 20s. He practiced in Barcelona for 6 years, and it's probably fair to say that there's not too many more inspiring places where you can gain this real design and architectural experience. So having this global perspective and eventually coming to Western Australia, we're fascinated to hear what you've got to say about your project and also your thoughts on WA.
Thanks, Kyle. I guess that the project that we're presenting today, and I'm pretty sure that you guys are familiar with, is the iconic Scarborough. Was on the media everywhere, a lot of pushback from the community, was covered in every single newspaper that you can find in Perth. But I guess that today is the opportunity to tell a lot of the stories that we have through the whole process that we went through. So I guess that what we have taken as an approach is looking at Scarborough. And I guess that early in the process, we identified the potential. And from someone that comes from overseas, you guys cannot imagine how beautiful the beachfront is in WA. You guys can imagine the potential of the beachfront and how buildings, which buildings like the one that we were proposing can actually start making a contribution and open a conversation to what the potential of the beachfront is. So this is just the location. This is looking at the redevelopment of the area. And early in the process, when we start engaging with the client, we identify how a great opportunity we have in our hands to provide something that was just completely different from what probably the authorities were looking at. So in here, we engaged with the client. We started the conversation with the client. And there were some key elements in the brief when we were meeting the client. Has to be tall, non-negotiable. How tall? Just push as much as you can. Then the community needed to be part of the engagement and needed to be a key part of what we were giving back to engage with the local authorities, but also with the local community. So we went through a long process just talking to business community people. We talked to the art groups within the community, and everyone involved that actually was helping us to just shape the building. So in here is just an early sort of slide just looking at the potential of the design, how it sits in a really prime position in relation to the beachfront. Unfortunately, we always felt that we were on the wrong side of the West Coast Highway for some reason. It's an unfortunate, but we tried to push some of those elements as much as we can. So we started looking at, South American, Miami, Ocean Beach Drive. You enjoy the lights, the sort of flavor that you find in these sort of spaces, and we were just trying to bring some of that to the building. Again, as I mentioned before, you feel like you're on the wrong side of West Coast Highway, and there was a long conversation about how we could create that sort of connection between the beachfront and the opposite side of West Coast Highway. So we started looking at engaging with the community. And unfortunately, this is the common sort of element when you are talking about buildings in Perth, not in my backyard. Everything beyond 2 stories is called high-rise, which is an interesting sort of statement that you find every Friday on the Post. So, and that just has become part of the routine. Every Friday, go to the Post and check the 4-story high towers that are happening along Perth, everywhere. So, knowing in my backyard, so we started looking at some of the really context that we are dealing with in terms of people pushing for a different way to look at the planning framework, might be looking at how design can actually become a community benefit, how actually good design actually becomes a key factor to change the city in a good way, in a good direction. So we started questioning the guidelines, and this is a city plan. This was a Scarborough, planned by the planners from the authority. So a bunch of podiums with a bunch of towers sitting on top of each other, no imagination about what the ground floor experience might look like, and no even questioning what the skyline might look like. So actually celebrating the beautiful hotel that you guys got in Rendezvous Hotel, which is a masterpiece. I'm pretty sure that you guys are happy with it. But I guess just looking at the same element across multiple sites and not really questioning how we can create a place in this area. So we tend to use these sort of diagrams all the time, and we have found that these sort of really diagrams are sort of for dummies to understand what we're trying to do with the massing of the building. A really simple graphic way to explain what are we trying to achieve. So we went through a series of diagrams explaining the massing of the building, how we were trying to relocate the massing of the building in a higher and taller sort of structure, the opportunities that we found on the ground floor. One of the elements that we were questioning from day one was the sort of podium and tower configuration. And I guess that we were looking for a sort of merging sort of element that wasn't really clear in terms of what the sort of form of the build form was going to look like. So we started looking at these sort of merging elements in the way that we were looking at the scheme. Then in here, we started comparing and presenting these sort of diagrams to the authorities. Quite surprised response. It was really positive. And obviously, as an architect, sometimes what happens is our hand tends to be a little bit quicker than our brain. So we put a scheme out there because we felt excited about the project. It's really exciting, so we put an idea out there and we said, look, this is what it looks like, right? And surprisingly for us, the response from all authorities was really positive in private. Everyone in private said, go for it. It's a great idea. You guys are going to make it happen. But we still had a little bit of concern about what the actual response through the sort of approval process was going to look like. And something that we found interesting is everybody went to the media and said, I have never seen the project. And at that point, we have actually met everyone through the whole authority, legal, planning framework to get some feedback before we actually went public. And everyone came out, denied the whole process. We have never seen, nobody has talked to me. I don't know what you guys are talking about. I haven't even informed what is going on in that sort of particular site along Scarborough. And this was some of the responses that we got in the project. So we started looking at no high-rise along the beach. We don't want the Gold Coast along Scarborough. And the sort of famous sort of Sunset No Scrapers group, which is an interesting one that pushes back a lot on height. But I guess that we have always seen an opportunity to use buildings and good design and architecture to talk to the community and trying to just communicate that good design is an actual community benefit. And looking at the guidelines in a different way, perhaps there is an opportunity to identify some potentials that were not considered before. So we check diagrams, we check a lot of ideas about the building. The scheme was calling for a 4-tower and a podium, a really sort of cookie cutter sort of approach. We started looking for different configurations on the tower, trying to look for something that was really exciting. Something that is important to mention is that the client was looking for their first project in Australia. So it was something that was critical for them. And the other priorities when we were looking at the project was that, as I mentioned before, an iconic project that starts sort of setting up the brand in Australia. The second was talking to the community, and budget was never an issue. That was an interesting sort of statement when we found out that perhaps it was important. And we went out with the public with this proposal, and this was the first scheme that we put out there that got a little bit more refinement. We understood what we were doing on the ground floor, the interface with the street. We saw the potential, and I guess one of the things that this scheme was trying to address is that we saw probably the long-term vision for Scarborough Beach Road as a main corridor to get to the beach. And we were just looking, probably not at the short term, but we were looking at the future of that area as a corridor to get to the beachfront. So you can see that we were looking for really open spaces, open areas on the ground floor, and trying to integrate the public space with the existing Scarborough Road beachfront. We started exploring a scheme, trying to bring as much as we can those sort of early images of a vibrant and a sort of happy place to be in. And, the idea just got really scrutinized in terms of, unfortunately, the numbers. Something that we have from the process in the design is that people get fixated with the numbers. They don't talk about design, they just talk about the number of stories or talk about the number of GVA, GFA, or all these sort of numbers that perhaps don't mean anything at the end of the day. This is an interesting sort of request. So at the time, the Avengers movie came up, and our client, a big fan of Tony Stark, and probably he thought he was a Tony Stark sort of Asian version. So he said, what if we just guys explore a helipad on the top of the building? And this is a text message on a Sunday afternoon from him saying, Felipe, what do you think about Tony Stark Tower? I said, okay, let me have a look. But always as we do with our clients, we started testing the idea of the Tony Stark sort of Iron Man sort of helipad. Thanks God it didn't fly. But I guess that as an architect, we always tend to address the client's feedback, just listen, take a deep breath, and then just look at what the option might look like. Some of the feedback on the project was really positive. I think people in Perth are changing. They want to see something different happening along the beachfront. And I guess that this was probably one of the early projects after a few years that opened that conversation. What are we doing with our beachfront? And for someone, as I mentioned before, that comes from overseas, I think this is just a waste opportunity. I think we are trying to give the back. We are just giving our back to the beachfront and not trying to enhance what the beachfront looks like and how we can just it is. The project got all over the media. It went bad. It was sort of quite well known that it got refused. It didn't fly. And at that time, we were invited, and it's not in this slide, but we were invited by the state government to sit down with them and relook at the scheme. And in that first meeting, something interesting to happen. You can imagine the developer and the client on one side with planners, lawyers, and everyone involved. It's like ready for a battle. And on the other side, the authorities, right? And one of the design review panel members stepped up and said, guys, can we just have everyone to leave? Just everyone leaves, and this is an architect's conversation. Hi, it's not a problem. Let's just find a solution just with architects in the room. And that's how we started the process of the project that actually got approved. So we started looking at different concepts in terms of what the ground floor interface might look like, in terms of addressing the existing conditions along Scarborough Beach Road and creating this sort of shells sort of approach for what we believe is the best way to address the pockets of public space that we created on the ground floor. And looking at the simple reference that you type when you're looking at your computer and you type Scarborough Beach, and this is the image that comes, right? So how we can create an element that is familiar to everyone, that just look for a really simple connection to the side. And all what we did was just rotating that image 90 degrees. And what we come up with is with a tower that started picking up on those sort of color elements and that material palette that was more familiar with the people within the area and in the wider sort of context. Again, go back to the dummies sort of diagrams to explain some of the principles so you make easy for people to digest what are you trying to do when you get some of the questions through the sort of design sort of process, looking at and trying to explain the reasons why we were doing what we were doing. And something that is interesting is that we spent probably in the first scheme almost a year. And when we were invited by the state government to sit down again and look at the scheme, It took us less than 3 months to come up with the final design that got approved. And it was just a really healthy architects discussing ideas and design, right? Planners are out of the question, no lawyers involved. The client wasn't even in the room. It's just a group of architects talking about design and good quality. And these are some of the early diagrams that we went through in terms of just looking at the scheme in a different way. And it was just focused on the ground floor interface, addressing Scarborough Beach Road, and trying to come up with a scheme that just talks about Scarborough. So you can see in here the diagrams. Some of the ideas about the ground floor, the potential of creating a different opportunities within the public space to create pockets where people could just come together. And I think that is something that perhaps the first scheme was trying to just address in a larger scale. I think in here we were looking at something that was more about pockets, smaller groups. And some of the elements that we were looking in trying to just create a Scarborough sort of reference and looking at, again, the public spaces. Probably a more balanced sort of approach in terms of the ground floor sort of experience. So those sort of early images of Miami and Ocean Beach Drive perhaps needed to be sort of pulled down a little bit and trying to find what a Scarborough might look like in terms of these sort of upcoming sort of developments. We were beyond what everyone was looking at. As I mentioned before, the client was, this was the first project in Australia, and the brand for them was really a key part of the conversation. So we went even to the point where we were proposing an art galleries on top of the building, viewing decks, and different sort of activities that we saw as a potential to make a contribution, not just to Perth in general, but to WA. I guess that these sort of projects bring the opportunity to create tourism sort of assets to the biggest sort of picture. Unfortunately, obviously, well, just didn't go ahead. It got approved. Happy news. We were really happy. Big dinner with the client, planners, and the lawyers again in the room. They were the big winners that night. They were really happy about the whole conversation. And unfortunately, the project didn't go ahead for different sort of reasons. I think the client, to some extent, has misled the community in terms of the reasons why it didn't go ahead. I think the project was a really great opportunity that perhaps they missed. I think nobody is going to get 43 stories approved in a 12-story sort of context, with all people supporting the proposal. So we actually, we were interested just to get a little bit of feedback on the two schemes. So all with the social media we have available at the moment, we went to Instagram, put the two proposals, asked people, which one you like, the first one or the second one? And it's sort of interesting to see how balanced the conversation was. And I think people got a little bit more emotionally attached to the first scheme rather than the one that got approved, just perhaps because it was longer in the sort of media, and this one was a sort of quick response that went out to the public. But I think the response was really positive in terms of the scheme. Something that I just squeezed a little project in here. And this is something that we as a practice are really interested in, and it's affordability. We believe that we as an architect got a bigger commitment to the community in terms of addressing some of the bigger issues that are actually happening are real. And I think we take some of the experiences of working with developers across, Perth, and we try to just pick up those sort of little pieces of knowledge and see how we can bring elements together to start addressing some of the elements in terms of feasibility. I want to skip a couple of these images, but the principle of the idea is we were, again, South American born, so I am quite familiar with some of these sort of examples. Affordability is a big sort of issue there. So just looking at some of the examples of Alejandro Aravena and Elemental Chile, looking at how we can make living and residential elements as affordable as possible. So we just bring some of the principles in here, and all what they talk about is what we keep looking at residential living in terms of square meters, what we then start looking at about cubic meters and the potential of people just growing with an existing sort of shell. So we brought some of those principles to these buildings. We came really close to winning. We didn't win. But it's all about creating a community within the project. A series of townhouses with a driveway in the middle, nothing really atypical, but the potential of creating these sort of spaces and creating community within the provision of basic spaces that we need to provide anyway. So I guess that we are, as a practice, quite interested in exploring those sort of solutions. I think we got a commitment as a practice to just go beyond what a normal developer or client would be asking for, and I think we got the commitment to just deliver even more. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Maybe a quick question for you, Felipe, first of all, and then probably Jimmy, it's very relevant for you as well. But if we start to look at, again, talking about the maturity of Perth and how it is starting to evolve, when we look at the city and the sprawling nature of it, and then we compare to, say, a Spain or a Paris, which has got this sort of 5, 6, 7 level of thickness that still allows obviously a high level of density, as opposed to what we see in Singapore and Manhattan and the like, that it feels like from a community perspective, over here at the moment they don't want either. So what I guess has occurred at, say, the city of Nedlands, for example, the community has said no, no, no for 10 to 15 years. The Department of Planning comes in and approves obviously a dramatic increase in height. So they end up getting exactly the opposite of what they wanted, but if they had a level of collaboration, they could have come to a happy medium. So how do you see this city trying to break through the challenges that we're seeing from a local community perspective with medium density to height? Because at the moment, it's either one or the other.
Yeah, I guess that one of the challenges, obviously the biggest challenge that we are sort of facing at the moment is fear to change. And Netherlands is a great example of what is really happening. I think it's educating sort of process that the community needs to go through. And I think the community needs to be educated on a couple of things. The first one is obviously design is the key element to find the solution to any outcome that they want. Unfortunately, the fixation with what the number looks like is what is probably delaying that sort of conversation. I think in a wider sort of picture, I think it's important to look at what transport looks like in terms of, we keep extending the city north to south, and we keep stretching the city as much as we can. I have found really surprising, I was with a few friends in New York a couple of years ago, and we were comparing just Perth. They didn't even know where Perth was. So I live in Perth in Australia, and the footprint of this city is even as big as LA. And you cannot even compare the transport in those sort of cities. So I guess it's a combination of trying to bring the different elements like transport, educating the community, to make them understand that people need to just try to be closer to where the key nodes of the cities are to make it a vibrant sort of place, which is one of the challenges.
And Jimmy, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's actually a big responsibility on developers and designers and architects to deliver great buildings, to actually demonstrate to the public that you can have medium and high density and it can be really good outcomes. And I think over the last 10 years, certainly it's been a really interesting shift, and it's certainly been consumer driven in making guys like you work harder in terms of what you're delivering, because you've gone from a situation where essentially the buying market was much more apathetic about one apartment project to another and what were the design benefits from one to the other. Whereas now I think they're starting to recognise the differences, whether it be sustainability or design. And I think that's really important. It's a sort of iterative process where people then start to go, actually, these sort of buildings I don't mind having in my neighbourhood. And I recount one story, which was, we did a project on William Street in Mount Lawley. It was a 5-storey building, kind of tough context because we had a heritage building behind, 2-storey house, across the road, a Buckridge bunch of flats at 6 stories, so it was a weird kind of nexus. But we did a building, big community angst. Years later when we went to take photos, we're taking photos and this old nonna stops me and goes, "What are you doing, what are you doing here?" And I was like, "Oh, we're taking photos." She goes, "Did you design this building?" I was like, "Yeah." She goes, "We didn't want this building, but we like this building." And like that's kind of the point. Like if you can actually deliver decent buildings, people go, "It's okay."
Start to learn, sure.
Yeah.
One more question before we go to obviously the audience for some questions. There was an interesting article that just came out the other day from Norman Foster talking about obviously the impact of this pandemic, and obviously in some respects we've been quite lucky here and probably a bit of a beacon that the world's looking at. He made some very interesting observations that, again, I'm keen on your thoughts on what the future might look like. And it really was about what some of these issues over the years and how they've supercharged things happening. So the Great Fire in the 1600s created building codes that led to fire brick construction. Cholera epidemic in the 19th century led to the Thames going from an open sewer to basically the birth of modern sanitisation, and then tuberculosis started to look at how we look at big windows, clean lines, sunlight, terraces and those sort of things. So with what we're seeing now, is this an opportunity to start to supercharge not necessarily dense products? I mean, the fear of people getting into lifts is probably real now, but how do we create this middle market where the focus is always on health, on design, on well-being, and does it allow the opportunity just to propel and maybe go ahead 10 to 20 years quicker than we might have otherwise? Yeah, look, I really hope that, you have the idea of, like in Melbourne, they haven't been able to go further than 5Ks from where they are, and in dense neighbourhoods, it's going to be really hard to recreate or get any sort of relationship with nature. So I hope that, what this spawns is actually people integrating a lot more landscape within design,
Carly had the excellent idea, she told me a couple of weeks ago about Langley Park. It's like, Perth's so far behind on tree planting numbers, why don't we just turn Langley Park into a forest? And what an incredible asset that would be for the city. And so I think, if we can actually start thinking about how we can work much better with landscape and ecology within our buildings so that we're adding to and helping actually sort out this town in a different way, that would be a huge benefit.
Okay. Felipe, your thoughts?
I guess that Perth is a really interesting spot. I guess that we got the opportunity here to learn from other cities' mistakes, but probably pick up on the good things from other cities. So you look at some of the up there sort of cities like Copenhagen, for example, and the way that they design residential buildings or even density in some of the areas, and how actually they manage not just to create community, but brings elements that actually start making a sustainable living. So we use some of the buildings, for example, by BIG, and where landscape is a key element because people want to be close to nature to some extent. And I think Perth got a great opportunity now to pick up on those sort of principles and take it to the next level, making it a WA sort of idea without mimicking what other city has found successful. And I keep probably going back to the same thing. I think this is an architect's conversation. It's a design-driven conversation. And we, as a part of the industry, we've got a big commitment to just show what the next step might look like. Because I think we are in the front seat of what this is, what the future might be in terms of density.
Sure. All right. Any questions? Carly.
I'm really interested in what you... Thank you, everybody. That was really amazing. I'm really interested in what you guys think that, I guess, collectively we can do as a profession to help people understand that it's not necessarily about what's happening in your own backyard, because your backyard is bigger than just the fence around it, and how that might affect some of these proposals.
I think engaging with the community is critical. I think not everybody is aware of the challenges that this city might be facing in the future or might be facing in the future. And I guess that engaging with the community as much as we can is really important. Something that we have found quite surprising is that your client comes to a meeting, you got a little bit of understanding about what the planning framework, you assume that the planning framework is the result of a community consultation sort of process, but then you find out that nobody knows what is going on. So I guess that engaging with the community as much as we can to explain to them that that change needs to happen, but there are ways to shape a good change to take this city to the next level is really important. I have always found surprising in Perth that people love going to Melbourne, New York, San Francisco, and they love everything that they found in there. But every time that you go there and you propose, let's do this in here, why would you go somewhere else if we can do it here? It's a big pushback. So it's still this sort of conflict that people have in relation to just change.
Yeah, and I tend to agree, and I think whenever we've done projects where we have started very early public consultation, it's been a much better outcome. I think naturally Anglo-Saxons, we're very bad at confrontation and debate, and we kind of shrink away from it a bit. So I think we could learn from you guys and actually have more robust conversations around actual disagreeing and that to be completely okay. Because I think we just repress too much of what we fear. So you've got to get it out.
I have found interesting when we engage with community, because we're putting a building out there and we want to talk to them before we start the sort of approval process. And then you find people just about to kill you just because what you're doing, right? Really emotional. It's really emotional, right? And then some people stay around, right? And they come to you private and say, I love the building. I love it. Are you being serious? You just 5 minutes you were just about to just throw me a rock. Like, what is going on? I say, no, I love it. I want you to see it happening, but it's my neighbor, so I need to show some support.
But then that's the story that comes up again and again in your experience.
Yeah. I guess from a planning and statutory perspective, some of probably the greater challenges is that we have 2.5 million people here and 149 local councils. Melbourne has 7.5 million people and 70 local councils, and Sydney 8.5 and 120 local councils. So our planning system has always revolved very heavily around local politics, and obviously that changes every several years with councillors. And I think, interestingly, obviously a week or two ago, ADC, who were doing a project in Mosman Park, that looks like it's going to be quite amazing. They took the pretty bullish step of putting an article and paying for it in the Post, saying that basically there was misinformation being presented by the local community. So I guess, again, one of those challenges of the SDA path now coming into play, which is meant to be temporary, which is here for 18 months, and probably, honestly, people like us hope it stays for good, because you bring decision makers into one place and it starts to get accurate information and make sure that what's getting disseminated is very clear. So have you by any chance, and I haven't asked either of you this, have any of your projects started to look at this SDA process over the next 18 months, which has been triggered by COVID, or not yet?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Okay. And have you found the process interesting, challenging?
About to start, basically.
We have, we are about to start another one. We have already started one. One of the directors in the practice started the process. Interesting response, I would say. It's an interesting response. I think that it's early days for people just to see the potential of the process that you just described, because I think, as I mentioned before, I think that there is the potential to bring everyone together and focus the conversation on good outcomes rather than the numbers at the end of the day.
Any other questions?
We're all back here asking what's SDA.
Sorry. Projects are basically of state significance, so it allows something that might need to go through a master plan or a scheme amendment. Instead of it taking historically 3 to 4 to 5 years, it basically brings all the decision makers into one room as part of the planning reform that the Department of Planning brought in April. Funnily enough, I think we were probably 3 or 4 months behind the eastern states, and they've had multiple projects already approved, whereas we're probably at the start of the process. But it is a good outcome, and it brings the focus very quickly into decision making.
So it's a different approving authority.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the intent is really positive.
Yep.
It's trying to just focus the conversations on the right things, rather than just getting sort of distracted by what the media does and the sort of emotional sort of component. It's just trying to focus on what is actually going to be a good outcome.
But having said all that, in terms of the amount of local authorities and population, WA still has a comparatively progressive planning framework. It's much harder to get a DA in Melbourne, I've found, and Sydney much the same, and it's a much longer period. So there's a lot more certainty, and the timeframes are much shorter here. So, we're not completely back.
No. I think 60% of them go to VCAT in Melbourne. So
Yeah. That's it.
And maybe it is the same everywhere in the world. We just like to complain every now and then as developers. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Tanya.
Thanks so much, guys. That's really interesting. I think you've obviously shared a really amazing design that you had proposed for Subi, but given the new master plan, do you have any comments that you can share on what you think of what's now been approved?
Oh, look, I mean, I think as I stated that, you don't want to have another Subi Centro, which is kind of meh, like there's. Because it doesn't have a true kind of heart to it. It's too consistently the same throughout. There's a bit of variation, and certainly now there's a bit more sort of medium and high density coming in. But I think Subi needs something more than just more houses and homes. You actually need, like it had for a long time, it had an identity, and I don't know if the master plan's going to allow for that or can conceive of it. I think it's great in terms of, hopefully there's a couple of really good buildings at PMH, which I hope they can retrofit, and I hope they actually just start to really get some interesting programmatic elements to actually activate it. Because you think like Rockaby and Hayes, particularly Hay, it's a ghost town. Like it is incredibly high amounts of tenancies for lease, and it needs to actually get charged with something which is a bit more inspiring than a series of development lots,
Any other questions? I'll ask you one, Felipe.
Go for it.
Obviously, growing up in South America and spending quite a bit of time in Barcelona, what inspired your work? Did you stand out front of some of those Gaudi buildings just staring at them for hours, or was there something else?
Look, it's sort of interesting when you have been in a few parts of the world, how you start learning from the sort of successes of those cities. And I guess that's something that we, as a practice, we always tend to look for is an identity on a building. We just don't have a formula. I think we just look at the site, we try to fight for something, for a point of difference, for what the building might bring. Not just as a piece of architecture, but also to the people surrounding the building. Big fan of, Eric Miralles. I worked for him for a long time, and it was a great school, probably not for Perth, just because probably some of the, let's say, the building sort of environments that we are dealing with. I remember we were, a while ago, I was working in the practice, and we were looking for a canopy, concrete sort of canopy, and in Barcelona, concrete is the first thing that you can have because it's the cheapest, right? So we were looking for a quite complex sort of form. Oh, it becomes a pain. It became a pain. And so I guess that we were trying to, all what we are trying to do is to change or trying to bring ideas. I try to push for ideas that perhaps I experienced before or things that I'm aware of. I'm trying to bring in here and we can just try to find a WA sort of identity. I'm really interested in that part, how we can just create WA as a design sort of hub that just doesn't mimic Melbourne or try to be a city in Europe, trying to just to be something that we don't have an answer for. I was having this conversation with a few guys a while ago and said, show me a WA building that looks like this is what WA talks about. And it's probably still an answer sort of question. So I guess that is an interesting sort of challenge.
Okay. How about you, Jimmy? When did you know you wanted to be an architect? And what were you thinking when you were going through high school about how it evolved?
Actually, in the room, my sister, she was taking me through Freo once, and we were walking down Pakenham Street, and she showed me one of Michael's buildings on the corner, and that was it. From then, I was like, because she was like, check out this cool building. I was like, what is that? She's like, this is architecture. I was like, cool, man. But also there was a book at school. It was a picture book. And it was all a series of animals' houses. And so the bee had this like sectional drawing, and it was like a penthouse apartment, disco, sunken lounge, the whole lot. The beaver had this cool sort of house, kitchen, semi-sunken, little kitchen window to the river. And it was all these amazing sectional drawings and this idea of different people's homes, which was so sort of bespoke to their needs, which got me interested, I guess.
So,
That's weird, buddy. That's all right.
So Jimmy's just designed his own house. So were there pictures of beavers in the sections and so forth as well?
Well, Klopper used to put all sorts of things in his sections, hooker in the corner and, love heart robe and all sorts of bits and pieces. Right. No beavers, no bees.
Okay. All right, we've only got a few minutes left, so I thought I'd ask you a couple of questions. You don't know what I'm about to ask you. They don't need to be one-word answers, but try and think of the answers pretty quickly, because I think...
Start with Jimmy.
Start with Jimmy. No.
Start with Jimmy.
I think we might know the answer to Jimmy after saying he was young and he went and saw one of Michael's buildings. So start with the first one, and this is for you, Felipe. If you had another architect that had to design your house in Perth, and you couldn't brief them, who would you choose?
Oh.
And you can't obviously choose
Needs
David.
to be a local one? Yeah. Needs to be a local
Needs to be
architect.
local.
Double architect. I would probably go with the space agency guys.
Okay.
And I know that he's
What if they weren't in the room? Would you still choose it?
I would still go with the space agency guys.
Okay.
I think he's
All
doing
right.
beautiful work.
Terrific. Okay.
And the more guys. I really am into that sort of really solid sort of architecture that just treats light as much as we can.
Okay, terrific.
So I really like that sort of work, more kind of space agency. Thanks, Michael.
Next question, Felipe, for you as well. Ocean, river, or city?
River.
For your house, river.
River.
Okay. And the reasons why?
I think something that, and I have actually discussed this before, just pick a location like South Perth. You got the river and the city behind, and it's consistently transforming. The lights, the movement, got texture, got flavor. The ocean is probably quite the same most of the time. I just like that sort of transformation or consistent sort of change that the river got.
Okay. And your favourite building in Perth? Can be old or new.
The city building in the city of Perth, the city house, the council house, beautiful.
And was almost going to be demolished in the 60s as well.
That would be a crime.
Yeah.
That would be a
And
crime.
the 90s. Yeah.
That would be
Sorry,
a
in the
crime.
90s. My apologies. Designed in the 60s. Okay, Jimmy, you've had a chance to think about it now, and let's assume you can't choose Michael.
It's been stolen. So
Yeah. All right.
how much money do I have?
If it's not someone in your practice and it's not Michael, who do you choose?
Oh, I think Blaine Brackenridge does incredible housing. That'd be pretty fun. Yeah.
Ocean River City?
Just built a house in the city, so I'll take that. But river over ocean, for
Okay.
sure.
And your favourite building in Perth?
Concert hall.
Concert Hall. Another brutalist building. Yeah, fantastic. All right, if there's any other questions, last call. Otherwise, we'll call it a night. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. So, thanks, Jimmy. Thanks for listening.